Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue with the program. I'm Shifar Raulako, and my guest today is Dereje Demissie Bulto. He's international jurist. We're going to talk about a host of issues unfolding here in Ethiopia vis-a-vis the legal aspects and others. So, to stay with us. Thank you so much for joining us. As an international jurist, I know that you're an international jurist. What are some of the things that you have been doing, and what are the things that you are doing now?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm a lawyer in the United States, in the state of Massachusetts. I'm a partner at a law firm. I've been handling for the past 25 years major crimes and civil rights cases. I also served as president of the Criminal Defense Lawyers Association of my state, the state of Massachusetts, and also as vice president of the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, which advocates for individual rights and freedoms and litigates cases. Been involved in cases overseas as well, in England and South Africa, cases here in Ethiopia, and a case in Kenya. Represented companies in the US and China, and individuals. My main interest is in individual rights, constitutional rights, as it relates to individuals in a criminal setting. A lot of the constitutional issues that arise in the United States arise out of in the context of criminal cases. Right to privacy, right to bear arms, a right to free assembly and petition the government, freedom of speech, and all those rights get affected when in criminal cases. So I've handled a number of those cases, trial and also appellate levels. I argued at different high courts. So that's my area of interest.
Let's just jump right into our discussion. And as you know, the criminal investigation report recently disclosed that the terrorist TPLF has killed thousands of innocent civilians in Amhara and Afar region. The findings also show that there is this extensive and systematic looting and vandalism of properties in both regions. So, as an international jurist, what are the crimes that you see being, unfolded here?
So, you're referring to the criminal investigation by the Ethiopian government?
Exactly, yes.
And I think it's widely reported and documented by various news organizations on the ground, and also by the international joint human rights and Ethiopian human rights report.
Right.
What makes the looting and the destruction in Amhara and Afar regions very different from all of the other accusations that we've seen so far is that those were very well documented. They were visible. You can see the level of destruction that was consistent in the cities that were occupied by TPLF forces. And you have the kind of evidence that you can rely on to make assessment, as opposed to some of the other accusations.
Right.
In Afar, for example, you have a situation where 100 plus children were killed in one incident, where there was shelling by TPLF forces. That was documented. The remains of those children were visibly, accounted for. Yeah. And you have the graves that these bodies were buried. So the kinds of crimes that you look at is internationally, you have crimes that constitute human rights violations, where you have a scale that is so high in proportion to a regular random crime, and it's so systematic that it rises to a level of an international human rights violation. You have mass killing, you have mass shelling of civilians that causes enormous loss of life. You have systematic destruction of health facilities. We're talking about over 2,000 of them in Amhara and Afar regions. You have systematic destruction of schools, and we're again talking about over 1,000 educational facilities. And then you have these serious accusations of rampant acts of sexual assault, organized and rampant throughout the Amhara and Afar regions, where those areas were occupied by TPLF forces. News organizations such as ISAT and others have gone and interviewed these individuals and tried to present actual proof of that. Whether or not those acts were directed, organized by the higher-ups, it's not clear to me. However, they were allowed to occur by people who are in charge of the TPLF forces in those areas. So all of those constitute various forms of crimes that can be prosecuted under international law and also local law. You have, as simple as when you point a gun at someone, that's an assault with a dangerous weapon. You know, when you shoot somebody, that's if the person dies, that's murder. If the person doesn't die, that's attempted murder. So just one act of pointing a gun and shooting at someone, you can have 3 or 4 or 5 crimes locally that can be prosecuted by the Ethiopian government. Internationally, you need a larger scale, a little bit more systematic. So all those elements exist in the events that happened in Amhara and Afar regions.
Wow, thank you so much for that wonderful explanation. You know, this being as it is, we read this report of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, which has really angered Ethiopians across this East African nation. Firstly, it lacks proper coverage and copious evidence, to shore up their findings. Secondly, it has blatantly failed to publicly rebuke the TPLF, which has rigged those horrible things that you've just raised. So, can you give me a sense of the flaws of this report from legal perspective and as an Ethiopian as well?
So, to be sure, the report did say both sides committed human rights violations. However, you referred to TPLF as a terrorist organization, for example. Exactly. They refer to TPLF as Tigrayan authorities. There's no Tigrayan there's no Tigray authority right now. When a state government becomes...
So the issue begins from right there.
The state government becomes defunct and turns into a rebellion. What you have is a rebel group. A state cannot exist without a recognition of the federal government. So once they become rebels, they have to be referred to as a rebel force and not a Tigrayan authority, okay? But my problem starts from the people who constituted this human rights experts. The chairperson, Ms. Murungi from Kenya, has consistently written against the Ethiopian government. She has tweeted several times very accusatory tweets against the government based on some reports that she's read on news accounts. You want a person to lead this kind of inquiry. You want someone who is impartial, who's maintained a level of impartiality, who has not made up his or her mind. But the chairperson, to begin with, was someone who is almost partisan in terms of her alliance with the TPLF. Never criticized TPLF for any of the acts that they've committed, but she's criticized the Ethiopian government. So from the very inception and the way it was constituted, and the way it was created following the joint task force, the joint report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Commission,
right,
which did, I would say, a much better job of documenting the atrocities that were alleged to have been committed, which did a much thorough investigation. At the heels of that report, it was not clear to me why you would need 3 human rights experts to do an investigation and a report. But you asked me about the flaws of their report. Their report does not even pass a laughing test. It's a joke. There are 3 experts who have, and this is based on their own report. I'm not making stuff up.
Yes.
I'm telling you what they admitted. In their report, they said, we had limitations, we have lack of resources, we have lack of access, we have lack of evidence, and yet we are going to make this report based on 2 months of investigation. And all of our investigations were conducted by remotely, by telephone. And we've never looked at the places, we've never visited any of the areas, we've never collected any evidence, we never analyzed any evidence. There is no forensics whatsoever, there is no scientific study of any of the evidence whatsoever, and yet, just with phone calls with people we've never met, whose identity we've never verified, whose demeanor we could not assess, whose credibility we could never determine.
Ridiculous.
We are going to make major accusations and huge conclusions about the Ethiopian government. And you can't accuse a government by talking to a bunch of people you've never met, whose identity you never verified, on the phone. Who are these people that were presented to them? Who presented those people? How did they gain access to them? How did they verify their stories? So the other really interesting aspect of this was a report that was created, again, after 2 months of investigation, where they said they didn't have resources. They only have 2 people who are full-time staff. And a scale of this kind of investigation that covers an area as large as France, and a population size that can be like 3 or 4 countries, right? You're talking about, it affected millions of people. And to do this kind of investigation, you need years. You need 3-4 years. You can't do this in 2 months. And why do you need to write a report in 2 months after talking to a bunch of people on the phone? It's really a sad testament to the kind of care and a level of seriousness that you would expect from an organization such as a commission such as this, that is supposed to report on serious allegations to a world body. So
that's also supposed to be fair, right?
It has to be thorough. So we, as a criminal defense lawyer of 25 years, and I've been involved in many cases in the US and overseas, I can tell you this. Any criminal investigation, a simple murder case, a simple murder, and right now I'm handling 3 murder cases in the US. A simple murder case takes 2-3 years to try.
That's long.
The investigation can take over a year. I have a murder case right now that goes back to 2019. The investigation is not completed. We're still waiting for DNA results. We know how much time a body takes to decompose, for example. If you cannot make an assessment of genocide, a claim of genocide, without visiting burial grounds, can you have genocide without bodies?
No.
And once you visit the burial grounds, you have to identify how these people were killed. Were they killed with bullets? Were they killed with explosives? Were they killed with knives? Are the wounds similar? Were they killed in the same place? We have you can analyze even dirt on their shoes to see where these people were. Did they come from the same area? The bodies were they collected from different places and put together. Yeah. How much time it takes for a human body to decompose is known. Were they killed on the same day? Mm-hmm. So all of these cannot be made, these studies cannot be made by a phone call. You can't do an international human rights investigation of genocide sitting in Addis Ababa. It's their own work. They never left Addis. Yeah. And they never went to any of these areas. And what's so interesting is they asked, I think, for help corroborating documents from local UN organizations, mm-hmm. and they said they did not get any. So one of the allegations they make is the Ethiopian government was delaying aid intentionally. That's the kind of accusation that you make after a thorough investigation. You can't make that kind of serious accusation sitting in Addis. So their investigation started after the joint human rights and the Ethiopian UN Human Rights and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission said there was no evidence of deliberate delay of humanitarian aid by the Ethiopian government. So what more additional evidence did they collect? I don't know, and they never said. And so it sounded to me like a political document as opposed to a serious human rights report.
Yeah, obviously that's why many Ethiopians are saying it's rushed, politically motivated, and it also contradicts itself. And there are lots of issues that you've eloquently raised. So do you see some kind of invisible hand deliberately trying to manipulate the situation in Ethiopia in clear favor of the terrorist TPLF here?
So there is no doubt in my mind that there are many in the European Union and other places who do not want the Ethiopian government to succeed. There is a fledgling democracy in Ethiopia. There is obviously an ongoing conflict in the north.
Right.
The Ethiopian people see some hope and some light at the end of the tunnel, where they went through 28 years of oppression under TPLF leadership. The forces that pushed for the creation of this human rights experts did so after receiving the Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report. They didn't like it. They didn't like its finding that it did not find evidence of genocide. It didn't say specifically we did not find evidence of genocide. They simply did not find genocide, so they didn't include it in the report. But they did say they didn't find evidence of systemic use of rape as weapon of war. That was a very serious allegation levied against the Ethiopian government. That report debunked that. Mm-hmm. They also said there is no evidence, and I'm quoting specifically, mm-hmm. there is no evidence that the Ethiopian government intentionally delayed human rights aid to Tigray. These 3 points did not sit well with a number of people who supported TPLF. So they created this, they pushed for the creation of this commission of experts. They picked 3 people, one from Kenya, one from the US, one from Sri Lanka. Gave them 2 people as a staff. And again, you said rushed. It was rushed for a reason. Why now, at this point, mm-hmm. Why would you release an incomplete report based on phone calls without doing any of the regular investigation and using the tools that we know are needed to do the kind of thorough investigation you're supposed to? The Joint UN Commission report and the Ethiopian Human Rights report was written after people went on the ground, did the investigation they needed to do. These people did not follow any of the protocols that you would need. So why now? Why release it when they themselves said, we prepared this without resources, we did not go to the places, we need more time, they were given a year to do this. we need more time, we need an extension. So you need an extension, ask for an extension.
Yeah.
Ask for an extension saying we have an incomplete report, we cannot release at this point because it's incomplete. We can't make conclusions based on incomplete report, so we need additional time. Or the other thing they should have done is say, this is what we found so far, we can't make any conclusions, we can't make any definitive statement because it's incomplete. We need additional time to do our job, and then we'll do our conclusions. But they released this report, incomplete report, with their conclusions, which is absurd.
Yeah.
So the timing is very suspect, and I think it has to do with a pressure that is mounted on them to release it at this time, because it's time is of the essence. Because of the situation on the ground,
yeah.
That is the reason I think is released now.
While Ethiopians voiced their dismay following this so-called report, members of the terrorist TPLF seem to be content with the contents of this report. We can draw a conclusion from this that there's some kind of collusion between the terrorist group and the people behind this report. What's your take on that?
I don't know about collusion. The way international diplomacy works is it's sort of complex. Pressure can be mounted and applied in a different way.
Okay.
And those pressures have a way of guiding actions. So I don't think there's a TPLF person directly talking to these people. Maybe. They did say they spoke to the Tigray authorities. I assume that they would also put their slant on the on the events. But what is really telling in terms of their impartiality is they did not address Afar region altogether. They neglected to deal with Afar altogether. Afar is a place where all of the atrocities in Afar were committed by TPLF, right? You have a report by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that directly addressed the killing of over 100 children. How can you ignore that? It's completely ignore the whole thing. And their claim that they did not have resources to cover Afar cannot pass muster, because most of their findings were based on reports. So there are reports about Afar. You can see them just the way you can see the reports regarding Tigray and Amhara region. So I just don't buy the fact that they didn't have resources to address Afar. If you address Afar, you address specifically atrocities committed by TPLF, and they chose not to address it. It's a choice.
Right. Talking about children, I think I should ask you this question as well. What's the crime of conscripting children as part of fines?
When the news initially surfaced about the use of children as soldiers in the rebel army of TPLF, the New York Times reported it as this glorious thing. Even children are rising up. And then someone pointed out, these are children. They have no business participating in any conflict.
Right.
And then they immediately retracted and they removed the picture from the New York Times. The way they see African children is different from the way they see other children. If you have a bunch of 12, 14-year-old white kids bearing arms and fighting in Ukraine, there will be an uproar.
Right.
There will be an uproar. But when it comes to Ethiopia, the organizations that are supposed to advocate for children have been silent, and they have been giving carte blanche for TPLF to continue to use children in their conflict. You have a situation where a bunch of kids are pictured marching with machine guns. It's absurd. It's crazy. And these children should be in school, not in war,
right,
or with their parents if the schools are closed. And this Human Rights Commission experts, 3 experts report mentions nothing about the thousands of children, thousands. We're not talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. We're talking about thousands of children. A lot of them were captured or surrendered to the Ethiopian government. It's just a sad thing to see. And it's one of the serious violations of international law to employ children in armed conflict.
Okay, thank you so much for that idea as well. So clearly this is part of the efforts being made, or being waged against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, I think, in close collaboration with the terrorist TPL. So how should Ethiopians defend themselves against such elements, trying to undermine the territorial integrity and sovereignty of these East African nations?
Yeah, so I want to be sure that I'm clear. Wherever there is a human rights violation, we Ethiopians, people of Ethiopian descent, should advocate for the prosecution of those people. Okay, the Ethiopian government has acknowledged there are people who committed atrocities. The question is whether it's systematic or not, and the government is actually prosecuting people. They created a task force. They're prosecuting people who committed atrocities. So on the TPLF side as well, there's going to be prosecution. However, the situation right now is that the government does not reach vast sections of that region, and a lot of people who are suspects of committing these acts are on the loose or outside of the government's jurisdiction. You have atrocities in Maikadra, where people were systematically selected based on their Amhara ethnicity and killed, while the TPLF army was protecting the killers, right? So we should advocate for prosecution of people who commit these atrocities. At the same time, we have to make sure these allegations are not used to undermine the government of Ethiopia. They cannot be used as a weapon in diplomacy to bolster a group that is committing these atrocities, right? Under the guise of advocating for human rights, they are advocating for sanctions against the Ethiopian government. There are people of Ethiopian descent who are petitioning the US government to impose economic sanctions, to cancel AGWA, to starve Ethiopians, literally, by making sure that Ethiopian government doesn't get any funding from IMF or World Bank, by withholding any aid. These measures are not going to be helpful for the Ethiopian people. We have to fight against them. The HR 60, those types of measures that were proposed and passed in the US are going to be detrimental not just to the government but to the regular people. I've seen the effects of AGWA, for example. 500 families, over 500 families lost jobs, employment. And the economy is impacted by that. So what do we do as people who are concerned for the welfare of Ethiopians? First and foremost, we have to voice our opinion. We have to petition the elected officials that represent us. I reside in the US, and we have a congressman and a senator that represents the state, two senators that represent the states that I reside in. I would be in touch with them. I let them know of my opinion. I ask them not to support these measures. And we do the same. Every Ethiopian descent is encouraged to do the same. We have to speak up. TPLF supporters were extremely active, very well organized in marshalling social media tools to create a narrative, whether it's true or false. They create narratives. They create a narrative of Tigray genocide. They create a narrative of rape as a weapon of war. They created a narrative of humanitarian aid being used as a weapon, right? These are extremely serious accusations. And they sway people. They sway governments. They create a lot of pressure on the Ethiopian government to economically, militarily, and all that.
Right.
So the Ethiopian government has, in the past 6-7 months, in my opinion, has drastically changed its approach and has recalibrated its foreign policy, and now is gaining upper hand diplomatically. And its efforts are bearing fruit. Basically, I think the world is beginning to see a lot of the lies that were told by TPLF leaders. They're beginning to see that they really are not trying to feed the Tigrayan people. They're trying to collect as much food so they can wage war. And there was pressure to bring in a lot of fuel, which the government of Ethiopia allowed. They weren't trying to use the fuel to transport the food. They were trying to use the fuel to transport conscripted young people, including children, to fight. I have never seen an organization committed to wiping out vast number of its the people that it claims to represent. And as you've seen, if they retreat, they get shot.
Right.
And we've seen we have heard exchanges. So we've heard exchanges between their commanders, giving orders to shoot those people. I mean, you're talking about children who are conscripted. They're going to be afraid. They're going to be, running away. Then
they're going to get
killed. They're not going to look at it and say, "Oh, don't shoot that 13-year-old kid," or "Don't shoot that." I mean, they will shoot everyone, right? If you order a person to use machine guns on people who are fleeing, that's what's going to happen. So it's a sad thing. It's a crazy situation. Again, both parties are now saying they're committed to. TPLF finally said they're committed to the UN peace process, right? So hopefully at some point this is going to be resolved, and we'll know what sort of atrocities were committed and who is responsible for that. But in the meantime, I think we all have to do what we can to get the truth out. We all have to do what we can to make sure that undue pressure is not brought upon the government, and it's not used to undermine the economy of this country. So we all have a role to play, and the government needs to continue to do what it's doing, to reach out. Especially with the U.S., you have to engage. The U.S. policy is not constant; it can change. It's fluid, but it needs engagement. You need to engage with policymakers, the State Department, and all the other players. It will also be very helpful for the government to hire a good lobbying firm.
Wow.
TPLF has lobbyists. Egypt has lobbyists. Sudan has lobbyists. Ethiopian government needs to have a lobbyist as well.
Thank you so much for your ideas.
Thank you.
With that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us. Until next time with another program, it's goodbye from me. Shukran.